Is Mike Fiona. I'm with the Escapist. I'm the news manager over there. Today, if you are in the right place, you're here for Future of the Shooter. We've got a really great panel lined up, and the best way to get started is just let everybody introduce themselves. So say a little bit of what you've worked on and who you are.
Hi, I'm Randy Bianski. I'm the Central Clancy writer for Ubisoft Red Storm, and I work largely on Tom Clancy's titles for Ruby, including the last few Splinter Cell games, a bunch of Ghost Recon, and Rainbow Six titles.
Yeah, my name is Randy Greenback. I'm on the design team at Insomniac Games here in North Carolina. I've worked with Rich in the past on various Tom Clancy games, Ghost Recon and Rainbow Six, and just very excited to talk to you here today about shooters.
Hey everyone, my name is Jim Brown. I'm the lead level designer at Epic Games. Worked on Gears franchise, much of the Inno franchise. Worked for the government for a while on America's Army, and before that I was at Sony working on Everwest.
Hey, what up? I'm Quinn Deloya, a multiplayer designer at Epic Games, and I worked on Gears of War 3, learned levels for that, and before that, I was working on Duke Nukem Forever.
So the reason we're kind of putting this panel together is of course the future of the shooter. And I don't think we would really need to ask that question if it wasn't for kind of the state of the genre right now, which isn't necessarily negative, but you can't argue that there are tons of shooters out there. So the first obvious question I have is, how do you set the game apart in this sea of shooters?
I think one of the ways we're starting to see games get set apart in the shooter genre is by paying attention to other elements that enhance the player experience besides the simple combat mechanic. We're starting to see much more attention paid to narrative storytelling and those elements of the game, where in the past you got short shrift or shunted off into briefings or walls of text. Now they're being more fully integrated, and doing that sort of storytelling, I think, is one of the things that can help us set a game apart.
Yeah. Also, art style is a really good way to kind of differentiate yourself from the crowd. Like you look at something like Team Fortress 2, and it has a look that's like completely all its own, right? So experimenting with varying degrees of realism, all the way heavily stylized, is another way to set yourself apart. Thematic setting, also the potentially tackling challenges, social issues could become another big thing. I know the last Ghost Recon that Rich was working on featured a lot of civilians in the environments and non-combatants, and you had to actually try not to shoot them. But in the future, I think players will get a chance to, designers will get a chance to put out other things like child soldiers. How do you deal with those?
Right. Yeah, I think the genre is really evolving a lot too. Like saying what is a shooter is really hard these days because it could be anything. Like, okay, it's first person with a gun in your hand. That could be just about any game with a marketability. And so it's kind of hard to put in the box and say what it is. And I also think that as we move forward, games are becoming more of a, we talk a lot about making games as a service, like right, not just, hey, here's a shooter kind of game in a box, but it's more of an interactive experience to play with your friends.
For me, the one thing that really helps just have a shooter stand out is to really, I guess I would say, freedom of play. So I think a lot of people talk about like free to play, but for me it's more freedom to play. And how I would express that is, if you have a shooter, people are shooting people all the time, there's people with guns, and freedom of play for me is allowing people to play in ways besides just being the slayer, the person that's really good at killing. And for me, one thing that I think would really help a game to stand out as a shooter is, what if there's someone that is able to not just shoot people, but also to make the weapons that people are shooting people with, right? What if there's a guy that was a gunsmith and he has materials that he collects in the game. If you're looking at other like crafting type games, what if this shooter had this guy's whole role, he just made guns and then it was on the market. Maybe it was sold to other players and the developer takes a cut, or maybe there's an in-game economy that's all driven. And for that shooter alone, you just have someone that could be doing something that's not just, hey, I'm shooting people with rocket launchers, all of that stuff. So that's one of the things I think that can help maybe shooters in the future is trying to incorporate more freedom of play.
Yeah. So one of the things we notice a little bit is that a lot of people tend to think that shooters are kind of similar to each other. And this is one of the reasons I was bringing up this question is because a lot of people are looking for ways to stand out. But my next question is, how important is it to stand out? I mean, how important is it to do something other than a game with really tightly made mechanics where you're a soldier and he's an enemy and you go for the headshot? I mean, how much of that is a drive in the development process to go beyond it? Or is it okay to not feel that drive?
I actually think it's vital to have something that you do better than anybody else in any game that you're making. Otherwise, it's another Me Too project, right? It doesn't matter what that is necessarily, but it has to be something. There has to be something special and unique about you to draw somebody that want to pay you money to play your game and want to even give up their even more valuable resource, their time. Right?
Sure.
I think it depends a lot on your project goals too. I just finished playing through Spec Ops: The Line. Is anybody out there playing? A few people. I would highly recommend it. It looks like a very run-of-the-mill mediocre shooter, and when you first start playing it, it is. And then like weird stuff starts to happen, and it kind of goes in this totally different direction. And it's like you were saying, it's a really great way to talk about story and character development and all these things that really make it separate. It's not just a shooter, there's other things hiding in it. I think that's really important, for sure.
There's no need to walk away from something that works well. I mean, one of the things we have these games that have certain similarities because our entire industry has been prototyping and iterating for 30 years now on making these things work really, really well. And stepping away from them just for the sake of stepping away from them is counterproductive. At the same time, if you can find something unique to add to them, that's where you're going to really make yourself stand out.
Yeah, I think that's the real key is, as you mentioned, the whole question is, having something that feels really tight and controlled really well. I think that's all good. Everyone wants to have that, but that's what you need to have first. That's the core. That's the base layer of your game. If you don't have that, then it doesn't matter how unique or whatever cool your game is. It's not going to do very well and not going to be received very well. That's the big key that developers we try to nail is getting the game to feel right. And then, as I said, you need to add whatever your spin is on that. That's something that we've tried to do as well. Is hey, let's take something and put our own spin on that.
Yeah. So this, of course, doesn't apply to everything, but as far as trends are concerned, one of the things that we've really started to notice, especially in the last 5 years, is this heightened emphasis on multiplayer components. It's something that, particular to this genre, people really enjoy. So how important is this multiplayer component? And do we have a future in this genre where people step back and focus again more on a campaign mode? Or is that a death sentence for a title?
I think currently, especially at the AAA publisher level, like if you don't have a multiplayer component, you're probably not getting greenlit. Like he just recently, Frank Gabo at EA actually came out publicly and said that on any game, if you don't have a multiplayer component, if you can't make the game a service, then we don't want to make it. But I think there will be people who break out and really do a good job of telling the story and creating interesting characters that they can connect, the players can connect to. And they can stand out without it. I think that's going to come from more of the indie level, the smaller developers that are out there that are going to be getting more and more opportunity to self-publish.
Yeah, I was actually going to hit on the same thing, that at the AAA level, whatever that is these days, there is a huge focus on you have to have multiplayer. Sometimes it's tacked on and not as good, but the chance to tell stories, I think, is still there, and a lot of kind of indie developers are going that route and being very successful with it. So I don't think you need to have it, but it's definitely going to add to the tail end of your product. It's going to extend its lifetime. But for me, it's not just multiplayer per se. It's more about the fact that games are oftentimes an escape, but they're oftentimes also a great chance to bring people together. So it's not necessarily multiplayer as much as bringing people together. So it could be co-op, it could be asynchronous. It's just ways for you to interact with other people online and kind of extend your network of friends.
Yeah, cooperative and competitive multiplayer combined, right? I mean, that's, I think Gears of War 2 with the Horde mode is like the main mode for that game. I mean, Gears of War 2's multiplayer out of the box was not the best, but Horde was fantastic, and it just brings all your people together, and that's, to me, the cooperative element can really, I guess I don't think that you need to have the competitive aspect, but you should have a social aspect, a multiplayer aspect of it.
That's one of the ways shooters are exploding right now in terms of innovation is not just in the game, but all the stuff that's being added outside the game to build a social environment and a community of these games through multiplayer.
So you brought up the publisher issue a little bit when you said EA kind of came out and said, this is what we're doing, this is where we're going. You guys are on, for the most part, the creative end, and you're game makers, not game sellers to a point. So are you happy about that? I mean, does it make you feel confined creatively? Is it something you don't mind? Is it something you would add anyway? I mean, there's certainly a financial aspect to it. Like you said, games with multiplayer are doing better on the market. But how does that work for you when you're the one behind the scenes actually making the thing?
Yeah, personally for me, I love multiplayer games. All the time, whether it's co-op or competitive. Like more and more these days, you're seeing more co-op campaign shooters that are allowing 2 or even 4 players or more to go through the actual story campaign. And I think that trend is going to probably really blow up in 2013. There's a ton of co-op campaign shooters. But as far as what I would want to make, I enjoy multiplayer shooters. I enjoy multiplayer games of all kinds, whether it's a board game or so. It doesn't really affect me at this moment, but I can see it could.
I mean, I think that at its heart, every game developer wants to make their game, not somebody else's game. That's always kind of your dream. So the trick is finding something that you love doing, that a publisher loves, and gives you the freedom to continue on. Nobody wants to be told what to make and what to do. So that's more of a, I guess, a business question. How's your relationship with your publisher, or do you even have one? A lot of people are self-publishing now. And I think that's also one of the reasons there's been such a huge explosion in the indie market or in the iPhone market, is because those people can do what they want to do on a small budget and get it published themselves.
And to be honest, sometimes constraints can be a real spur to creativity. You're told, okay, you need to have a co-op campaign that tells the story as well as the single-player campaign, and you've created a single-player campaign that is very focused on specific individual moments. Well, that's a design challenge, that's a narrative challenge, that's a storytelling challenge that can really drive you to do some creative, interesting things you wouldn't necessarily have done without having that absolute boundary laid down that you have to follow.
So let me get this straight. The question is, how does it make me feel being a creative, designing games?
Sure. I mean, do you feel cramped, like you're restrained and you have to put this in, or is it,
It makes me really happy, to be honest. It's awesome. It's an awesome job to be able to get in arguments with coworkers over rocket launcher fire rate. I kind of like that, as opposed to, looking at whatever, just another job, what I mean? I don't want to diss on jobs. My job, I love it. I love being able to talk with people and to come up with environments and systems that players will play with. And I don't, sometimes constraints are good as well, because if there's no constraints, then the game will never ship, probably.
So this is perhaps the best example only because no one at this table is involved with it, so maybe it's safe to bring up. But right now, I think one of the things gamers feel about the genre is that we're slipping in some ways into a a sequel culture, not just with first-person shooters. I mean, all sorts of games, movies are suffering from this. But what do you guys think about what I might call like an iterative series, right? So like Call of Duty, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 sequels on sequels and so forth. Is this hurting the genre? Is this something that as we move into the future and continue to bring all these ideas you guys are talking about, you know, like you're talking about like a weaponsmith and all this cool stuff, is that hurting the industry? Is it stopping people from making games like your weaponsmith game and so forth? Or is it just giving players more what they want? I mean, where's that balance?
I personally, you know, they've adopted pretty much the Madden, you know, there's a yearly release. I don't think that's necessarily hurting the genre as a whole, but because they add to it every year, and they mix it up and they try something new. It may not be the biggest, most exciting thing, and again, you can draw the parallel to Madden. You know, they add, you know, some small nuanced feature every year, and they might subtract something out of it and add a few more technical features. But they add something there and they push it, and that becomes the mainstay for that title. I think as long as they're doing that and they don't just punch out and they're just doing a yearly release, and they're not advancing something, even if it's on the story front, telling a new story, putting it into a new setting can be somewhat exciting. Trying you know, alternate timelines or something like that could be good too. But as far as holding back the genre, no, I don't think it is. I think putting more shooters out is a good thing, as long as you are trying.
As long as the sequels are evolving something instead of just repackaging, I think that's good for the genre, for the fans, and for the developers as well. You've got something strong to build from that gives you something that gives you a place to experiment from. At the same time, if we have things that are evergreens that sell consistently well, hopefully that gives publishers enough of an interest ability that they can afford to take some chances, try some new things, develop some new IPs, because they know that the next iteration of those core franchises is going to be there, it's going to do well, it's going to make sure that the checks clear people get.
Yeah, I'll play the next Mario Kart. I'm going to you. People are going to do it, right? As long as the interest is there, then we as an industry are going to keep making those games for you, right? That's why we're here. And eventually that bubble may burst, I don't know, but as long as the interest is there and it's still evolving and still getting better, there's no reason to stop, really.
Sure.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think, I mean, that's more like what we talked about, that's kind of like a service. Every year you kind of renew your subscription. It's another $60, I guess, if you want to look at the Call of Duty example. But at the same time, we want to talk about the core mechanics are all there, but those games are different to a degree. They have, you know, different eras that they're in. There's, you know, this year is the Black Ops year, and I think there's definitely differences there. But I don't think it hurts the genre at all. I think it allows other people to see what they do and what they do well, and to eventually maybe put their spin on it, do something with it. And I personally think it's a good thing to get that many people playing the genre, to be playing shooters. Like, there's a lot of people playing this game. There's a lot of people playing that shooter game. And I think as developers, I think it's nice to have that many people interested in the genre. If you're developing a shooter, and then to play that game and see why people like that game.
And from a selfish point of view, it's also really cool to see how they tackled the same problems or how they handled, you know, like as a developer, how they handled the same situations we were trying to do. And it's also like kind of competitive, like everybody's trying to one-up one another so the games continue to get better, and I think that's a good thing.
So how much crossbreeding is there? I mean, do you guys take a lot of inspiration from other games? Do you try to specifically like stay away from that idea?
I think, you know, something that lies underneath is that you don't work in games unless you play games. And you play everybody's games, and you love playing games. And so, you know, even if it's just subconscious, you absorb what else is out there, you see what benchmarks have been set, and you try to do better.
Sure.
Yeah, and then also, like, you know, I might be inspired by somebody else's game or a feature or mechanic within it, and I don't just say, oh, well, I need that for my game. You would actually take it, and it gives you a new idea, a new slant on it. All of a sudden, you have this new way of approaching that one thing, and you've tested it enough that it becomes unique and kind of has a life of its own.
Yeah, there's a cool parable that there's only two stories in the world. That a stranger comes to town or somebody goes on a trip. When you think about it, those are the same story, just from the opposite end of the same perspective. So again, it's all about presentation, right? Like, yes, I play everything I can get my hands on, whether it's a shooter or not. I'm a game fan of games. I want to see how they do it and what they're doing and learn from it, as well as just enjoy it.
Yeah, I think my number one tip for this is play the B-rated games as well. The games that are you would consider not to be these big-time AAA awesome franchises. Play the games that are like even based off of like a movie franchise. You know, I mean, play the games that aren't, like I said, probably the better games. And the reason you want to play those is because there's a lot of good things you can find there, like people that did take risks, and you'll be able to find interesting and really cool things that happen in those games. And then you can even take that and apply that to your game as well.
So let's talk a little bit more about innovation in a different way. We've got a lot of stuff coming out, right? We've got motion controls. I'm sure you guys have seen the Oculus Rift, right? Kind of new VR headset and peripheral. What do you want, just personally? Do you want better graphics? Do you want photorealistic graphics? Do you want motion controls? What are you looking for your next game? If you had it, if it were fantasy world.
Fantasy world, I think what I would look for, I want to have more ways to engage the player and bring them into the game, but also cue off of how they feel at the moment, and their pulse rate, you know, what they're looking at. Like literally, like you brought up the Oculus Rift, you know, you're going to have this device on your head where you put it on, and that will bring out, you know, all of a sudden all the third-person shooters that are out now, you might start seeing more of a slant back to first-person shooting because of that.
Right.
But just imagine having some sensors that are on the inside of the thing, detecting your heart rate, your body temperature, and kind of reacting. And the game knows you're looking at certain things, or you are bored now. You've got to mix it up. And the game system to actually spawn an enemy at the right point, or throw a surprise at you of some sort.
So you're way more specific than I am. I mean, this is going to sound like a cop-out, but it absolutely isn't. I want more. The more things we can do, the more ways we get players to input, the more actions they can do, the better the technology for facial capture and animation and interaction and anything else. The more tools I have in my kit to do my job well, the more ways I can interact with you, the player, to tell a better story, to make writing that affects you more directly, that doesn't get in the way of your gameplay, is a more seamless part of your experience. So every technological advance comes along, I'm ready for it, I want to know what I can do with it, how I can take that and do my job better.
I agree with you, but in a lot of ways I feel the opposite. Like, I want less. I want a streamlined experience. I want to just get to the core of what a game is and engage the player and the players and bring them together, really. So I don't really care as much what the input device is or how we get there. I just want it to be a very simple, understandable experience that people can do together. People can experience together.
I'm with the kind of the original question when how you want games to look. I definitely want to play a game that looks substantially better than where we are now. But next gen, I want to see something that I would say passes the mom test. You know, when your mom walks in the room and she looks at the TV and it looks amazing, and she's like, "Oh, that looks amazing," but if she doesn't notice that looks amazing, then it doesn't pass the test, right? And that's when I was playing like the N64 for the first time, and I was playing like Madden 2000. My dad walks in, he's like, "Oh, that looks so like realistic." And that was, like 12 years ago. And he was like, "Man, that looks so real. It's like the Redskins on TV." I'm like, "I know, look at this, Dad. You hit this button, you tackle them, it looks great." And for me, I want the next generation, I want it to really to be that. Input devices, everything like Jim says, yeah, whatever. But visually, I want it to really stand out. I want to be able to have, when my mom comes in the room, if I still live with my mom, when she comes to visit, she walks in, she's like, "Oh my gosh, that looks amazing." That's what I want.
See, I thought the mom test was, shouldn't you be outside?
So speaking of input devices, since you're so interested, a lot of gamer culture right now is I think tied to having these really tight controls. I mean, most games offer, sometimes up to 10 or more different configurations of buttons, and it's really become a thing. Somebody is good at one shooter, sometimes they can carry over, find a similar configuration, and use those exact same skills. Do you think we're going to hit a point anytime soon where that primary input device can change, and how much should it change? So here's an example. When the Wii came out and we got all the Wii Sports stuff, right? You got Wii Bowling. And there's a point where it can only get so real before you actually just need to have a bowling ball and throw it. And if you had motion controls with, let's say, a Kung Fu game, you never want to take it to that 1-1 ratio of control because we don't actually know Kung Fu. Well, I can only speak for myself, but I can say you probably can't fight somebody in Tekken for real. So where is that cap for the shooter? Is that cap where we have people running around in a virtual reality field, like a holodeck, actually holding a gun? Or is that future sticking with this tight, buttons represent actions type of input?
No, I definitely don't think buttons are the future. I think they'll always be around. They'll always be quick, real simple. I mean, they're tactile and quick, right? But I think eventually, and this is like I'm not saying like 2 years from now we're going to have a holodeck experience, but it's coming. All that stuff's going to converge. You got the Kinect being able to recognize, like literally, the Kinect 2 scan your face and kind of figure out how you feel, your emotions. Are you happy? Are you sad? Are you angry? Are you frustrated? And the game could account for it. I think a lot of elements are going to just converge, and you're going to slowly see. Okay, well now I have a projection display that just gives me a sense that I'm in a different environment. I'm not just in my living room. And it might start there, and it might evolve, and all of a sudden you see something on your wall out of your peripheral, in the corner of your eye, and you're like, oh, enemy just jumped out, and you react to it in the game. Stuff like that, and surround sound obviously helps up the ante and brings you into the game. Like little things like that are going to converge as we drive towards the future.
Ultimately, I think the ultimate controller, the most versatile one we're going to have is this. I mean, it can do anything. How many played Bowser Roberts as a kid? Bang, bang. Congratulations, you have it's an infinitely versatile control system. And that's where we're eventually going to get to. But you're right, we don't want to be one-to-one because that one-to-one takes away the fantasy of playing games.
Exactly.
So what we can imagine around this is where it's going.
Yeah, I mean, if I want to, the thing is like space. Like that's the biggest hang up, I think, is when we're talking like holodeck stuff. Like, unless we have a warehouse dedicated to some virtual reality like place, I mean, it's really hard. And you're walking on a treadmill, through a jungle, and it looks like it's space is limited. We got our living room, or we've got our office, we got a mouse and keyboard or controller, and I think that's going to be the hardest thing. So we talk about it as being able to escape into something. I can hop on my couch, and with my fingers, I can walk a guy through a military complex or through a hospital. And so I think it'll be a while till we could actually get into something where my space isn't affected by me walking through it. I don't know how we'll be able to do that someday, but that's, I think, until we can figure out something about that, we're going to have to be using our either something that's somewhat stationary or using your hand to help you move. So if it's a total virtual reality thing, what if this hand controls where you move? Kind of like with a controller, your left thumb is your movement and your right thumb is your look. If it's virtual reality and you can't be moving like physically with your feet, maybe this is how you move. I'm going forward, back, right hand is aiming. I mean, I could see something along that lines if I put on a headset and aim with this hand and have like one-to-one aiming, and then I don't know, it's almost like Kinect in a way, but I kind of like the hardware. I like being able to hold either this or this mouse and keyboard. That's kind of me. Maybe I'm a dinosaur in that.
No, I'm exactly the same way. I'm a terrible person to answer this question. I think that there's some magical force that lives inside my iPhone that makes it go. I have no idea, no predictions. I never would have thought that we would go away from the mouse and keyboard to a simple controller. And now we're going to come back, but there's also cameras and all kinds of craziness involved. So,
I actually have a question before I over here. Does anybody think that somebody's going to solve, like we went from mouse and keyboard to controller.
I would also say in a lot of ways it already has, like, the success of Android, iPhone, touchscreens is something nobody really could have predicted. I mean, obviously, yeah, you have the virtual reality Star Wars or the Star Trek stuff that you've been seeing on TV for years, but it's like, here's like, it's in my pocket.
As far as shooters, you think it's even something that should be destroyed?
I don't know. I mean, if people want to play shooters on a little tiny screen.
Well, I know one of the things that they've been doing with them is like augmented reality, where you're looking through the screen at a world where enemies that's kind of rudimentary at the moment are maybe popping behind walls in your kitchen. And you're looking and kind of do the freeform aiming. So there's some innovation that I've seen out there, but for the most part, most of the people that I've spoken to from the player side, they're not there yet. I don't know anyone who's a hardcore like, I gotta rush home from school and play whatever shooter on my iPhone. It's
It's impossible until it suddenly becomes obvious.
Yeah.
And nobody's interested until suddenly it's the next awesome thing.
So let's move to another component of the genre moving forward. And again, this cannot apply to every single game. But one of the things that people are talking about as shooters come out and as multiplayer kind of gets more attention is the single-player campaigns maybe getting less attention, not so much in mechanics because that carries over in multiplayer, but perhaps from a campaign or narrative standpoint. So my next question is, what do you think about story? And is it okay to forgive, quote-unquote, something that is not necessarily a complete story? Maybe it's too short, maybe it's poorly written in some people's opinions. Is that forgivable if you have a game that excels on a purely mechanical level?
Okay, I'm probably the wrong person to be leading here. I have a few strongly held opinions about the subject of story. Story, I think one of the great fallacies of our industry, the shooter genre in particular, is divorcing narrative from gameplay. It's all part of the player experience. A story doesn't have to be long, a story doesn't have to be deep, a story doesn't have to be detailed, a story doesn't have to be anything other than fun, as long as it's appropriate to the player experience. And developing your story along with the rest of the game so that reinforcing the gameplay reinforces it, and together they make for a better player experience is what you have to strive for. Shortchanging your story is the same as shortchanging any other element of your game. It's part of the player experience. You need to put your best into it.
Not much more left to say.
I don't know, I tend to think that the industry's concept of story is completely backwards. You look at games like Heavy Rain, which are known for having a really, really fantastic and deep story, and like you said, controls, totally separate issue, maybe they were great, maybe they weren't, but that game is still very popular for what it is. But I have just as much of an attachment to the story of Donkey Kong. Like no story at all, because for me, and this is kind of what Quinn was hitting on earlier, I think as well, is that the story is what the player makes. Like the player story is way more important than whatever story I'm trying to tell, and their personal experience is what they're going to remember, not like this convoluted series of characters in the world events that you've created. So I think that is where the focus of the industry should be, is on allowing and empowering the players to come up with their own stories, rather than just be part of our stories.
And I definitely agree with you there, especially for more open-ended games, more open world style stuff like Borderlands or whatever. People usually don't recount the main storyline per se, they recount to other people, and at the water cooler in the morning or whatever. What they did last night and the awesome random thing that took place and how they overcame it, right? And but if you have a linear shooter that, or semi-linear shooter that is telling a very specific story about a specific set of characters, and the player isn't selecting or creating a character, then I think that is 100% right. But if you are doing the campaign that's scripted and you're telling a story, you can obviously forgive. You can forgive bad controls in that somewhat if the story is great, and just likewise you can forgive a poor story and a shooter because that's not the focus.
One of the interesting things, though, is even in games where you have a defined character, when somebody's talking about what they did, they always say, I did this. It's not Sam Fisher did this. It's not Mr. G did this. They're talking about their experience. They're saying, I did this. And that's something that I think is key to doing appropriate game story, which is we're not writing the story, we're putting the building blocks of the story in the game for the player to experience in their own way so that they make their story out of how they encounter the stuff.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I prefer the story, the simpler the story, the better, you know, point A, point B, like Doom, you know?
Right.
It's like, what are you doing in Doom, like the original Doom? You know, you're shooting a bunch of demons from hell.
Right.
But the levels are really cool because it's not very linear. I mean, A and B, point A to point B, it's the same location, but there's a lot of choice in between those levels and little secret passages, things like that. But Doom felt really good. It felt really good blasting people with that shotgun.
No, you're absolutely right.
And evading those imp fireballs and you know, holding down the shift key, moving really quickly. I mean, there was a lot of empowerment to the player there that, in a way, a lot of more modern games have lost that, right?
You're right, that protagonist didn't even have a name. Right.
I mean, it's always the silent protagonist that doesn't talk, you know, like the Gordon Freeman, or you go heavy on it, you know, like Nathan Drake.
Right.
It just depends, and different stories for different folks. But for me, I think the simpler the story, and you don't need to worry about the story as much. You worry more about the design. I think that's where you have a shooter that has a higher chance of being more successful and popular. Not necessarily money-wise, but feel better in my opinion.
So then what is the most important thing to get right? When you sit down and you're starting work on a game, you say, if we mess everything else up in this game, what is the one, as small as you can get it, component to get right? Meaning, gameplay is not an acceptable answer.
Shooting.
If you're making a shooter, you'll be able to shoot.
Right. But do you mean like the tightness of the controls? I mean like, when you say like making the shooting right, I mean what is that? What are you trying to nail? Because at the end of the day, at least from a player perspective, somebody who doesn't design games, I think of aim, and I'm sure it's way more complicated than this, as my thumb moves a joystick and my reticule moves over an enemy, and then I press a button and that enemy dies. And that's the core of the experience to most players, right? So what makes it different between games? What are you guys doing and focusing on that's changing that from game to game?
I mean, a lot of it can be boiled down to just the feel. Like, there are so many things, like you could just say the reticle design, and people go, okay, well, it's a thing on the screen, it's a circle. But no, that thing gives you feedback, and a lot of people don't notice it, or don't discount, or don't, just focus in on it. But it's telling you when you're over an enemy, it's probably turning red. It's getting tighter when you have a better shot. It's probably blowing out, when you're running and moving, because you don't have as good of a shot. Like, there's a lot of feedback in something as nuanced as a reticle. So there's so many factors to consider when getting shooting right. And if there's that many factors in the system just for feedback for the player and the reticle, just imagine the shooting model and everything that goes into that.
I'd go with the feedback, especially because does the result of firing that weapon equal what the player has in their mind, like the psychology behind it? If you have a shotgun and you shoot someone at close range, you have a certain expectancy of what you think would happen there. Same thing if you have a sniper rifle and you shoot someone from far away, the result needs to match that, right? And if it doesn't, that's where the shooting doesn't feel good. Is the sniper rifle not an accurate weapon? I mean, that kind of doesn't make sense because it's a sniper rifle. And there's plenty of games that haven't nailed just these simple things. If I pull a shotgun and I shoot someone at close range, I mean, depend on the rating of your game, whether it's mature or not. In Gears of War, people explode all over the place when you shoot someone with a shotgun. And again, I could go back to Doom. Shooting those green toxic barrels next to an imp, and that imp like jibs fly in the opposite direction, that right there feels amazing.
Okay, we brought this up a little bit earlier, but I want to go back to it for a second, which is the idea of indie game developers. I think right now, when players hear indie, their mind for the most part doesn't go to shooters. It goes to innovative platformers, puzzlers, the stuff that's cropping up on Steam. I'm sure there is a shooter indie community out there, but do you think that they're competitive against the quote-unquote AAA, those things you were just talking about, dialing in that feedback and designing all of those components? Is that something that they can hope to hit? And if it's super easy to hit, what are you guys doing with the rest of this budget, putting together these gigantic projects?
Well, I think the reason you don't see a lot of indie shooters, besides mods and total conversions, right now is because they're harder to make and make something new, right? They take a lot of time and input and energy from a larger team than you would for a single platform or even a single puzzle game, right? But engines, you got UDK and you got all these tool sets, Unity, they're starting to equalize the playing field a little bit. And I think indies will move into the shooter market because they will have more stuff prepackaged, ready to go, that'll help them jumpstart into doing something innovative. And hopefully, and I think the indie community is already doing this. They have a laser focus on one point of innovation, one thing they want to do better than anything. And they may get it out and maybe a little fast and loose, but they prove an idea. And I think you're going to see that more and more moving into the shooter space.
I think it's difficult for, if we talk about like making shooters, I think it's just 3D in general. If you add 3D, I mean, a small indie team, I mean, you need to then start model characters in 3D, you need all these animations and effects, you need 3D environments. But you could make a shooter, a platform shooter that's 2D, like Contra, I guess is a shooter, right? It's an action shooter game. It's an awesome one. But, Smash TV. It's an awesome game as well. It's a shooter game, and that's something that any team can kind of do. And then you can get street cred that way and on these mobile devices, right? And that's where I think it helps those guys. That's been the big boon to have these mobile devices for the indie crowd, especially.
In a lot of ways, the first-person shooters where spectacle lives these days. It's where the high production values are, where the spectacular moments are. And a lot of the other genres, it's easier to take a more stylized approach, and that I think has helped encourage the development in the indie space because it's easier to do something unique and interesting and without having to fall back, having to achieve that spectacle. And like Brent says, the tools get better. I think people will be able to match a little bit more of that. Hopefully, we'll see them do a little more of that space. Alternatively, we could see people looking to get that stripped down gameplay and move away from the spectacle, including the notion of first-person shooter from spectacle in some of the audience's mind. Then I think you'll see a better chance of success there.
And I think they are out there, really. I mean, even at Epic, we're about 300 people now, and we're still considered a small indie company.
That's across all the studios as well.
That's not all in.
That's not here in this area.
But there are indie companies out there that are doing it, that are just a handful of guys. As you were saying earlier, you just got to find them. Right? You got to go out there, you got to play those games, you got to give them a chance. Because they're all, for the most part, they're all following their dream. They're all doing something that they think is really special and unique. And it's just a matter of how successful they were and how much it catches on. Because it is a big mountain to fight against this giant multi-million-dollar budgets with publisher backing and all that. But there's people out there doing great stuff, and you just got to look for it.
Yeah, like the most notable that I've seen that just immediately was Hawking, right? Next shooter. 9 guys started that project, and I don't even think they started with it from 9, but I think that's what when they really hit their stride and really start showing stuff. They had 9 guys making that, and that game looks beautiful, right? So it's coming, and the indies are definitely catching up. They definitely are going to be within a stone throw of us AAA. So we just got to be on the toes.
Right. So, so a lot of what you guys are saying is that indie games, as far as this genre, it's a little harder to get over the hill, right, as opposed to something like a 2D platformer. So if they're shut out for a little while, there's kind of this perception right now that the big publishers are a bit more leery of innovation because it's risky. right? And the bigger the budget, the less you want to risk. So there's this idea that a lot of the new innovation is coming through in the game developers. So if they are being slightly more shut out from this particular genre, does that mean that as we move forward, the shooter genre will stagnate more than competing genres?
I don't think so. I mean, you've seen the same thing. The same thing can be said of movies or books or virtually any form of entertainment out there, right? Like, you're not going to make it unless you're mainstream. It's just kind of what people say. I don't necessarily believe that's true. It's kind of what we were hitting on earlier, is that you just kind of have to find that thing that makes you special, that makes you stand out. And if you can build up enough momentum and get enough people behind it, you can. And even though there's a lot of samey shooters out there, I wouldn't say the genre has not stagnated in the past few years. I mean, there's lots of really exciting and new things happening with every iteration of every game or every new title that comes out. So it's there. It's just a matter of how big it gets and who latches on to it.
Yeah. All right, well, I've got one more question for you guys, and I want to open it up to some Q&A with the audience. And for the final question, if you had total control of a team of whoever you wanted and unlimited budget, what's your next shooter look like? What is it? Yeah, no restraints.
Saying the words "no restraint" to a bunch of game developers is really bad.
Light up the guns that shoot ice cream. Who knows?
So maybe I can bring this down to a more manageable level of a question.
Let's say.
Is there anything that you've personally ever really wanted to do, but for whatever reason it's not your job title, you're not in control of the strings of whatever company, that you haven't been able to put in your game yet? Any idea, whether it's narrative, mechanic-wise? Is there something that you've had as a dream to get into a game and you haven't done yet, for whatever reason?
Gunsmith.
Yeah, let's show
Get under the red scarf, I'll show you.
For me, this isn't. I already feel pretty happy with what I'm doing as far as what we're building over at Epic. But one thing that I think, in regards to the future and what could be really cool and different, is shooters are shooters, and you go to E3, you see what's coming. I mean, and what has always been there. It's a lot of our games are built around I guess a violent nature, right? Kill this guy, kill that guy, point A to point B, do this and do that. But what I think would be really interesting is if in the future we could ever make a game with shooter type mechanics that actually isn't, the coding and the dressing isn't violent, right? You're not killing people. What if there was this is kind of like, if you look at, say, Dead Space is very violent and killing these freakish monsters, but the guy is an engineer. I was like, what if that game was drastically different and you weren't actually killing any of those things, but you had to go and repair things, even with the same mechanics, right? And I don't know if us as a culture will ever be interested in playing a game that was, what if I'm this emergency medic and I have to get over here to help these wounded soldiers and do some really cool game mechanics where I need to bandage this guy or evade other people that are trying to get me and lead a team, like I said, being a medic. Or what if there's a cool fireman game? Like Backdraft the movie is awesome. Make it a game, And what if there's a really cool fireman game? And I think that is something that could totally be done. I just don't know if us as a culture would be that interested in making a game where I don't blow people away, or creatures, or aliens, or monsters. Right?
For me, it would be something that brings everyone I know, all my friends and family together in some way. I don't know what that is, whether maybe it's like a game that I play on the console at home and my sister plays on her phone and somebody else reads a book and then we can all talk about the story. I don't know, like whatever that is, but just something that brings everyone into like a common thread, so we can really share whatever that experience is as a group, and kind of compare notes.
Even through different devices, right?
Yeah.
Like what if your grandma's on her phone? I mean, I found that out in my reunion. I mean, my mom was playing Angry Birds. She's never played a game before in my life. I'm like, what are you doing? Oh, I need to get all the stars on this level. I'm like, okay, you stole my mind right now, Mom. I mean, you took my Nintendo away when I was a kid because I wasn't doing good at school. But Yeah, I think bringing people together, and that's would be another really cool game, is have someone, you know, maybe directing troops on their iPad, and the troops are people playing a first-person shooter.
Yeah, I definitely think all that stuff is coming. You got Smart Glass, you have Sony Mobile, Wii U. All that's coming where you can have somebody doing different kinds of interactions, and they don't have to be as hardcore as what's going on the game screen. But
I hate that word.
yeah, it's out there.
I use it and I hate it.
But I'll use it again. The shooters are normally perceived as very hardcore things, right? Especially multiplayer shooters, right?
Absolutely.
There's a high barrier to entry. There's a fear I'm going to lose, that they're going to talk bad about me, they're going to trash talk me. I'm going to muck it all up for the team, right? I would love to create something that kind of slow ramps players into multiplayer and keeps the genre growing. Because if nobody else new comes into the shooter genre and wants to approach it on ramp in, then we're going to run out of people to impress, and we're going to start seeing the genre get more and more important. And I think we need to be more inclusive. And ideas like that everybody's been talking about, the smart glass, and they help push people to what's on the screen. Check it out. I can interact with it in a low stress way. And we just need to come up with ways that players can also grab a controller and maybe have an alternate way to interact with the world. Whether it's going around and healing people or commanding units or building things, it's just to kind of push them to keep trying and increase the level of comfortableness.
It's a truism, you know, every developer has their dream project, and one that they're going to make someday. And most of us have 4 or 5 or 20 or so of those. And you know, these range from the most granular thing, that's well, I want to try this implementation next game, to huge game concepts. But really, and again, this is going to sound kind of Pollyanna, the game I want to make is the next game. I want to see what's available to me and take advantage of that and do everything I can with it. And if it coincides with one of these pipe dreams I've got, great, that'll be awesome. If not, let's see what I can do with what's happening.
Well, I want to open it up to some questions from the audience. If you guys have a question, will you do me a favor and line up in the center aisle here? We're going to bring a mic. We're going to get to as many as we can before we run out of time. So no life story, please, before launching into the questions.